If shyness or low self-esteem has ever held you back from living your best life, then my next conversation is just for you. Joining me now for 100 Huntley Street on the road in Newfoundland and Labrador is Mike Freake. He is the lead pastor of Evangel Pentacostal Community Church in Gander. He is also the host of Heart Matters, a very popular television show across Newfoundland and Labrador. Welcome to 100 Huntley Street, Mike.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Mike, going back to your years growing up in Birchie Bay, Newfoundland, and your exposure to God then in the church, what would you say your idea of God was like back in those early years?
Yeah, so, I grew up in a little tiny town. I think the population when I was growing up there was probably about 800. It's probably a little bit less now, but, faith church was a big part of our community. My family brought me to church every Sunday morning, every Sunday evening, Sunday school, all of that. So I grew up in that. And I can honestly say that, I went because I had to, so I endured it. Can't say I really enjoyed it. I was looking forward, honestly looking forward to the day where I could make my own decision. When I got old enough so that I would not have to ever attend church again. So that's kind of how I was feeling back then.
Wow. And, today you're a lead pastor. You are sharing about what God does in people's lives on a show, Heart Matters. So you're very out in the public eye in front of people sharing about God. Were you always outgoing, even if you didn't feel this connection to God when you were younger, but did you have this skill set of communicating?
No, absolutely not. I didn't. I was not like that at all. Growing up, I was extremely shy. It was one of the things that I really struggled with, having conversations with people, being in front of people, was, those things that I just struggle with on a daily basis. Having a conversation like this with cameras. I mean, if that was back then, I would die 1,000 deaths.
What do you think was the root of that kind of like insecurity, shyness, or low self-esteem? Can you see a cause when you look back? Sometimes we can't. It's just our personality.
Yeah. Like for me, I always struggled with, confidence, self-esteem. Growing up, especially into my, junior high and into the beginning of senior high years at school, I really struggle with that. I struggle with my own identity, my value. And I honestly did blame God, a lot for the way that I was. I was always smaller than everyone else. I was that kid that was always picked last for school, sports, and that sort of thing. And, and I remember lots of times, even like looking into the mirror and thinking like, oh, you're such a loser, and I struggled with that. And I would say that oftentimes even out loud.
You mentioned that it impacted your view of God, and, you were angry at him or blamed him for how he'd made you, but it also led to depression and isolation. What was your breaking point?
Yeah, I think my breaking point was probably, I recall it very clearly, vividly, on a youth night. I would still go to church, and I was involved in our local youth ministry. And I remember on one Wednesday night, I was in grade 11 at the time, that I really did have an encounter with God. And it was around an altar, it was in a worship time, and I felt, I think, for the very first time in my entire life up to that point, I really had an experience with the Holy Spirit. I had an experience with God that was real. And for me, it was really that moment, that night, that I think God altered my life. I always like to say this, that, it was at an altar that God altered my life. And he did. It was that moment.
And soon enough, you stumble on something called Circle Square Ranch.
Yeah.
A ministry.
Yeah.
Tell me more, because this is an interesting part of your story for many reasons.
Yeah. I knew about Circle Square Ranch from the TV show when I was growing up, and that's really all I knew about it. I did find it through a friend that Circle Square Ranch had a location in Manuels, just outside of St. John's. And I went there that first week, and I thought, okay, these guys, every single one of them, they've lost their minds. They're all crazy, And so I think within like 3 days, it was staff training week, and after the first 3 days, I'm thinking, I got to get out of here.
Like, were they outgoing?
Well, they were just outgoing, and they were happy, and they were singing and doing actions and doing skits. And I'm supposed to be a part of this because I'm a staff member. And I'm thinking, no way, it ain't happening. It was, later on that week that, I made the decision, okay, let's just give it a try. So I started to participate, and I got involved, and it was during that time, that staff training week, that I started to come out of my shell, started to do ministry, and in a way that I never ever did before. So it was really a big life altering time for me.
And soon enough, you go to Bible college, but you also then go into youth ministry, and a lot of what you experienced at Circle Square Ranch,
Right.
Coming out of your shell, becoming dramatic, all these different things. Actually really play out in the youth ministry. So God makes a round hole for the round peg. He just finds your niche in a way.
Right.
Tell me a little more about those early years of youth ministry and how you saw these shifts in how God had changed you and how that played out.
Right. Yeah. So, a lot of the things that I learned at Circle Square Ranch, because after my first year, I went back to Bible college. Summertime, I'd go back to the ranch again. I went back to Bible college. Then I came back as program director. So I did that for about 3 or 4 years. I was program director. And so I graduated Bible college, went into ministry, and I started to really apply a lot of the principles and approaches that I learned at this camp into ministry life. I started to see a lot of growth and kids' lives, and so Circle Square Ranch was a major shifting point in my life and even how I did ministry.
Mike, as the years went on, you've become a lead pastor at a very big church, but that was from a pretty significant experience.
Right.
More of being called out of your comfort zone, again, answering God, but it was in the midst of a crisis.
It was.
Tell me a little more about where you are today and what happened.
Yeah. So I moved to Gander in 2002. I was youth pastor there for 8 years. I became associate after that for 11 years. And in the 19th year, it was on a Mother's Day that our lead pastor, following the morning service, he was out for a drive on the Trans-Canada, and it was just on his way back, just about 10 minutes outside of town, that he got into a motor vehicle accident and tragically died instantly. And so that was one of the most difficult things that I've ever faced, and certainly challenging for our congregation. And so again, I'm in this place where I'm, okay, God, what is it you're doing? And what am I supposed to do? So so I'm leading the church through this just because I had to step into that, leading the funeral and leading and ministering to the family and really just guiding the church through just impossible grief. And I remember one day I was in the office, and I was sitting there with one of our staff members and just talking. I was like, what do we do now? And where do we go? And what is it God is leading us to do? And so we went into our lead pastor's office, and we're just sitting in his office, and he had just purchased about 4 or 5 brand new books that he was going to read. And as I'm sitting there, I never took notice of it before, but as I was sitting there, I looked at the book on the top of his pile, and it was called Passing the Leadership Baton. I picked it up, and on the back of the book, I just looked at it briefly, and it says, how to lead a church. If you're the lead pastor, how to lead a church when the lead pastor has tragically died. Oh. I'm like, oh my goodness. I opened up to that chapter, and it said, the very first line was, it was in the month of May on a beautiful day, and all the similarities to what we're facing and going through at that exact moment. And the author begins to communicate a story of when they were trying to contact their lead pastor, and he wasn't answering the phone because he had died. And that was exactly what we had just gone through. I'm calling, I'm going through all of this, and the similarities are like unbelievable. But it was that moment, I think, in all of my own insecurities. Again, the insecurities, it always seems to to rear its ugly head in my life.
We're human.
Yeah, that's right.
A theme I see in your life, Mike, is God calling you out of your comfort zone and your willingness to say yes. So everything from serving in church when maybe you don't feel comfortable there, to speaking in front of people when you've tended to be shy, hosting on Heart Matters, leading a big congregation in a moment of crisis. What would you say to the person right now who's saying, I know God is calling me to something in particular, but it's going to take me out of my comfort zone? What would you say to them?
Yeah. Well, I would say, and this is what I've learned in my own life, is that, I've said this so many times to so many people, that, God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. You know what I mean? And so I will be the first to admit, I am not qualified. I've got my own issues. I've got my own insecurities. I've got my own struggles. But the beautiful thing about this amazing relationship with God is that He qualifies. He helps those who are called. He calls you, and he equips you, and He helps you. He gives you the strength and the guidance that we all need. So for anyone who's watching today that feels like that, if you glean nothing else from this story, is the fact that God can use you in some way, and He will give you the strength, and He will equip you to live out the life that He's called you to live. And, we see that time and time again throughout the Bible. We see Moses, who had his own insecurities. We see David, who was just a shepherd boy. We see, a ragtag bunch of disciples who they had their own issues.
Yeah.
But those were the ones that God picked and He chose. And I love the scripture that says, that He puts this treasure in jars of clay, just broken, weak vessels. And He chooses those people. Why? To show that this power is not from us, that it's from Him. And, and I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful that even in my own fear and insecurity, that I was willing to say, okay, God, let's see where this goes.
Well, I'm so thankful God chose you and that you said yes. And I know that people across Newfoundland and Labrador are thankful for that too, Mike, because you inspire a lot of people. Thank you for sharing your story with us today and all your time with us.
You're very welcome.